Alright, so for this section we're going to talk about marijuana or cannabis, whatever you want to call it. So marijuana, it's the most commonly used illicit drug in the United States, and I wrote this a little bit ago, and obviously it's starting to become legal in more places, and illicit just means illegal. So let's just say outside of alcohol, marijuana is the next most commonly used substance. And marijuana is just one form, of a cannabinoid, right? So cannabis. So really, cannabis is, it's really its own category, right? You have like uppers, downers, right? Stimulants, benzos, right? And the cannabinoids are really their own kind of category. It's not really a hallucinogen. It's not. It's kind of a downer, right? So it's really its own thing, and the substance THC, I'm not even going to try to go ahead and say it, but that's the chemical, the substance that has the intoxicating effect. So the more THC something has, the more intoxicating it is, right? So, cannabis, right, it's got kind of a mixed reputation, but there's some medicinal benefits that are starting to become more commonly used, right? And so I'd say with cannabis, just like anything else, there's risks and benefits. I think before we weighed really heavily on the risks, think of, back in the day, reefer madness and the hysteria around and why it was illegal, right, and how it was terrible and all that. And now we're kind of at a stage, I think we've swung the other way, where it's like, oh, this is the best stuff in the world and no issue whatsoever, and all you are crazy for saying so. Well, I think, like most anything else, personally, that it is in the middle, the right answer, right? And so, again, we talked about earlier in alcohol, is that no substance in itself is good or bad. It is just about how it is used and the effect that it so happens to have on your body. So let's take a look at some of the risks and benefit of using cannabis. So for so there are those, medical, it's starting to become more and more popular and more documented benefit medically. So alleviating symptoms of, cancer, HIV/AIDS, MS, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, Crohn's. So it really does have some significant benefit, and it is safer to some, painkillers like opioids and that kind of thing. Reducing nausea, increasing appetite, glaucoma, right? So there's a ton. Some even with mental health it could be helpful, one may say. But that's a little debatable too. But so mostly those medicinal, so cannabinoids, we're talking about cannabis, we talked about THC, but cannabinoids are multiple different types of cannabinoids that are even within something like marijuana, right? So there's a THC percentage, and then something like CBD, which is another form of a cannabinoid. That one doesn't have any intoxicating effect, and that's one of the ones that's associated with the most benefit as far as medicinal. So just some of the medicinal comes from THC, some comes from CBD. So yeah, I guess it really just depends, but those are where some of those medical, and we're learning more about the medical benefits. So what is the risk and reward? Now some of the risks, right, and these are things that aren't really, especially with the conversation being so geared towards how it's amazing. Yes, there are some awesome medical benefits that can happen from it, but I think a lot of people take that too far, right? Especially like teenagers, you'll see this the most. Like, hey, it's legal and blah, 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 and therefore it's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, right? And that's not necessarily true, right? Marijuana, just like any other substance, right, it is an addictive substance, right? And people debate that too. But it does release higher levels of dopamine, and anything that does that has a higher risk potential, right? It's a exogenous, so outside of the body, substance that when ingested increases dopamine level, right? Anything that does that will be addictive. It doesn't matter if it's a behavior, right? Like food, sex, those things can be addictive too, right? And those are endogenous, right? Those are food and sex or something from inside the body, whereas these are coming from outside, right? These are, unnatural per se. So people who started smoking marijuana heavily in their teens had an ongoing use disorder, lost an average of 8 IQ points between 13 and 38. The loss of mental abilities didn't fully return those who quit as adults, right? So that's kind of a big deal. Like, I don't want to really give up IQ points personally. I mean, I don't have that many to spare to begin with, but, it's kind of a big deal, right? And I think part of the reason is, that it does affect your cognitive functioning, how quick you are. And I think that especially when you are, smoking, and maybe even the decreased motivation that comes with it, right? Those are your formidable years of um, brain development. So when you're clouding that, it maybe makes sense as to why you won't mature to that full rate, and you may lose some IQ points. Breathing problems. So here's the thing: anything you put into your lungs that is not oxygen, there is very much a risk of bad things happening. Right? Smoking, you look at the vaping and stuff, where, who knows now what's going on with that. But, I mean, clearly with smoking, with tar buildup, it's an issue. It really is an issue. So, you can't say something's fully safe and healthy if you're smoking it. Mental health. I really think this is probably one of the biggest issues people don't see, is that it really does have a negative impact on mental health. Pretty much any substance does. But, with marijuana, which is kind of a depressant, right, kind of slows everything down. Well, if you have a depressive disorder or something like that, it really does have a negative effect on depression. And a lot of times people, they come in and say, well, I smoke because of depression and anxiety. Well, people drink because of depression and anxiety, but I think ultimately it does make it worse. You're not getting those natural, neurotransmitter, feel-good chemicals that you would normally be getting, right? So it's kind of like a negative cycle that people get into of using to kind of temporarily feel better, but then it makes the problem itself worse, right? So higher suicidal thoughts, increased symptoms of paranoia, other thought disorder symptoms. Okay, so a thought disorder is something like schizophrenia, right? Where, you think like hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, that kind of thing. Well, we're finding that marijuana, like, it really triggers something. Because some people have that potential, right? They may have that gene. It may have happened anyway that they were going to get it, but something with weed in particular, compared to a lot of other drugs, it brings it on. Like, it's like putting gasoline on. It's one of the worst things that when my clients who have, like, delusional disorders, schizophrenia, like, is they cannot use weed. It is, for whatever reason, just gasoline. And a lot of times it's hard to know, but there's a lot of worry too that sometimes these kids that are using marijuana that are getting these, that they maybe would not have had them otherwise. So there is a weird correlation with that people have to be careful with. And you're seeing it quite a bit. Negative effects on short-term memory, problem solving. I mean, if any of you guys have been high, I mean, you know what I mean. It's like you're not acing any tests on it. It's, and the effects are much longer than other substances, right? When the more you do weed, I mean, it stays in your system longer. So it takes a while of you being off of it, especially if you're a regular user, for your mind to go back and be as sharp as it was before. So some other the risks, people usually who smoke regularly have lower rates of life satisfaction, poor mental health, physical health, more relationship issues, less academic and career success, higher likelihood of dropping out of school, absences, accidents, injuries. 30% of those who use marijuana may develop some degree of marijuana use. So that's really high. Okay, so, I don't know exactly what's going on there, but, usually the percentage is like 8 of some substances, right? So like with alcohol, I think we're seeing like 6 or 7, whereas like 30 with marijuana, right? So, I mean, I don't know, again, it's on a continuum, it's on a spectrum, but what I do see is I think I see, weed in people being much more like habit forming, right? Of like more people will become like daily users of it or regular users, right? Versus alcohol, where I think it takes time. But once someone becomes an addict of alcohol, it's like worse than heroin, right? They have horrible withdrawal. It's late stage out. It's a horrible, horrible disease of addiction. Whereas cannabis, I think more people get to that place of dependence. Now, they may not have those same types of overt consequences like drunk driving accidents. Now, it's not good for your driving, believe me. But you have just much more subtle consequences. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So I think that's where sometimes, marijuana has a perceived reputation of being less problematic, and it really is than a lot of other things, right? I'd rather have someone be a marijuana addict or whatever, use that regularly, than like heroin or even be like an alcoholic. Because there are just much more issues that are going to happen with some of those other ones. But I think that's where it's kind of a sleeper. It's a little bit more subtle, and then therefore more people think it's okay, and more people have those consequences who get addicted. So, and I think we talked about this back in general substance use with withdrawal. Is that when people are smoking daily, you're going to have withdrawal. If you regulate your body in any way, right, with an outside substance, when you get it out of your system, you will have a withdrawal. You'll have a rebound. It may not be dangerous. You may not have to be hospitalized for it, but grouchiness, sleepiness, sleeplessness, because people smoke to sleep all the time, and then when they stop doing it, they can't sleep. Decreased appetite. When you smoke, you get a huge appetite, and so a lot of times people need to smoke before they eat. Anxiety, cravings. So, so there are actually, despite contrary belief, there's going to be withdrawal just inherently in any substance, and for some people it is really real. That people get addicted. The rates of THC have gone up markedly, especially, this is in 2011. We're, now here 2019 as I'm recording this, now that it's been legal, it's just through the roof what the THC content is, right? So what was once maybe less addictive or whatever, now it's like, that addictive substance is way higher, right? So the higher, of a potency that is, the higher of a rate of addiction that you're going to have. So, that's something to keep in mind. The CBD hasn't much gone up, except for the ones now that are purposely bringing it up for the medicinal reasons. Now you have things that, like these concentrated forms, like wax stabs, let's say where your average, let's say 30, 40, something on the really high grade marijuanas. Now you're looking at, 40 to 80, 90% of THC content. So that's just going to be that much more addictive. The quicker substance hits you, the more it hits you, the more addictive it is psychologically, right? So, yeah, so that's, so it's just something to be like really mindful of. And so I gave a couple examples of, so I talk about testing here. So it does, like I said, it stays in your system much longer. It could be up to a couple months because it stores in your fat. So it takes a while for you to get those effects out of your system. So I tell these two stories just to kind of show the difference of what a cannabis addiction could look like compared to maybe a more harder drug, but why that may not always necessarily mean that it's that much better. All right, so just bear with me here. So two people here. One is Mike. So Mike is someone... Oh, lost him. Let's get back to Mike. There it is. So Mike used drugs from a young age, started with marijuana. He graduated to using heroin and cocaine by 21. He failed out of college as a sophomore. He had run-ins with the law and did some jail time. He lost all ties with his friends and family. He went to treatment multiple times, could not hold down a job, could not function in life. Mike was forced to get sober at 22 and managed to turn his life around. He went from getting D's and F's to A's and B's when he returned to school. He's now 10 years sober, a wife, kids, family, close friends, amazing job he loves. He's in a 12-step program, finds he cannot use substances of any kind, right? So that's, not an atypical story of someone who's gone through treatment, who's gone through addiction, right? We didn't really talk about the whole gateway drug thing, and I think, maybe perceived like a gateway drug, and maybe it is, I don't know. I don't think it matters that much. It's, any gateway drug is the first drug that you use. If you start with heroin, it's going to be a gateway to other things, right? But again, alcohol and marijuana are going to be the ones you probably use first because they seem to be the most safe, right? Or they're the less, issues with them, of what people perceive, right? So a lot of times people start with it. So that's Mike, right? This guy who just, crashed and burned really hard, right? Now that's Mike, the drug addict. Now we're going to look at Michael, his counterpart. So, what's going on here? Okay, so Michael used marijuana from a young age as well. He tried some other drugs but didn't like them. He just stayed with weed and smoked multiple times a day. Michael always found a way to get high, or he always found a way to get by. He got C's in schools and failed a class here and there because of his attendance. He got into a local college but took 5 years to graduate. He worked menial jobs to get by. He never had issues with the law. His family was always worried about him and felt he wasn't living up to his potential, but they were still pretty close. Michael never went to treatment. He stayed close with his friends from high school. Some smoked weed too, but many grew out of it and had families. Michael always found a way to get a job. He got okay jobs, out of college, but never really got promoted. He was just content with going to work and getting by. Mike was content playing video games and didn't have too many hobbies. He had a girlfriend, but his relationships didn't last. He had girlfriends. At 36, he finally got sick of smoking and cut back, though he found it hard. He eventually got promoted and married. He continued to smoke on occasions. Or this guy too, maybe just eventually quit at some point. But, so here are just two very different types of addiction. Now the question is, what is worse, right? Now, it's obvious to say this guy, Mike, really went hard out the gate and almost died, many times. But, he was able to turn it around, and for him it was more black and white. Right, it was either I either use all in or I don't. Now, whereas Michael, he was someone who just kind of stayed with weed, right? He used it more like a medication, right? He was never doing horrible, but he was never really doing great. So this is a pretty typical case of someone who's like addicted to weed, right? Because they always say, hey, look, I'm not Mike. I never had this issue. I've never, so I'll ask them, well, what are your consequences? Well, I've never done this. I've never done that. I've never had this happen. But then with them, I call it, the disease or a condition of missed opportunities. Because it wasn't about what he lost. It wasn't about, like, what was noticeably taken from him. Others maybe saw it, but it was opportunities that he missed, right? Instead of, like, having more hobbies, he would just sit around and play video games. He's a little lazier. He wasn't quite running as sharp as he always could have. He didn't, have as much motivation. Didn't have as much ambition or drive. His health suffered a bit, but it's harder to see that than with Mike, who really just crashed and burned. So that's why I put those two things up, is that, even though both these things are addictions, they may have very different courses, and recovery may look really different. But I think it really just highlights that it's not just an innocuous and, benign substance. It really does affect people's lives negatively. And it's sometimes harder to see with something like marijuana. So we will leave it there.